Welcome back, folks, to Amped Up with Cliff Schechter. I am that guy, Cliff Schechter, along with the Emmy-winning, wonderful MSNBC former host and very talented David Schuster. How are you, David?
I am fired up, Cliff. I don't even know where to begin. Should we talk about Tom Homan? Yes, that is his name, Homan. He's the guy who allegedly took a $50,000 bribe during the Trump campaign in order to
get some favors, which was creative, you know.
Yeah, and he's the border czar. So Donald Trump sends him to Minneapolis and brings out Bovino and essentially sidelines Kristi Noem. And Homan admits at a news conference, things here by ICE were not perfect. You think? Two people were killed. So the understatement, but anyway, he's now claiming that, well, we're working with local officials and maybe we'll start to draw down some of the ICE agents and Border Patrol agents who are roaming around Minneapolis.
Well, that's nice. And it's good to know that they still have such a passion and talent for euphemism. I would have thought that was impossible with Homan, who sort of resembles a human thumb, but I guess it is. Who knew? We're going to talk more, folks, about, obviously we're going to be talking about Minneapolis. I think it's got reverberations. I don't think it does way beyond what, our current moment. Go back into history, xenophobia, the Johnson Act, I think back in 1924, and various Operation Wetback, which I hate to even say, but also just racial history in this country in general. And we are lucky enough to have an incredibly talented, I would say, columnist here with us, who I bet you've all read. We have Eugene Robinson, formerly. Why don't I invite him in as I introduce him?
Hey, guys.
Hey.
Hail to the victors, valiant.
Oh, yeah, the Michigan guys got to get it going.
One of a proud Michigan alum and perhaps one of the most esteemed graduates of the University of Michigan. And I always like to say that, Eugene, before we talk about your Pulitzer Prize, because they're both impressive.
Yeah. Honestly, Eugene, Michigan's produced some okay people, but like Tom Brady won a few awards, and they didn't.
Yeah, he was, Arthur Miller wrote a few plays. They're like a few people.
But did Tom Brady get an award from FIFA? He did not.
No.
Well, and to be clear, Eugene Robinson is to column writing what Tom Brady has been to Super Bowls and what
absolutely.
Arthur Miller's been to playwright.
That's
Eugene Robinson.
He didn't make it up. He didn't get it from FIFA. He didn't get it from like some other random organization out there, like foreign countries meeting him that wanted to make him happy. So they drew it on a piece of paper or like made a paper mache. The man has won a Pulitzer because he can write.
Eugene, how are you? It's so great to see you.
I'm great. How are you? Good to see you.
We're doing well. We're doing this whole Substack thing. It's a new world.
Yeah, it is a new world. It's a new world, and here we are. We're living in it and doing what we can, in the middle of this insanity. So.
Well, we're going to talk about your book that's coming out. We're going to talk about some of the other things and some of the other stuff you've written. But I got to ask you, because we started the show talking about Minneapolis, and there's Tom Homan now in charge, Homan, which I think is hilarious. And he's saying, oh yeah, it was not perfect the way ICE. What do you make of how the Trump administration, both in terms of policy but also politics, is now handling Minneapolis?
I'm not sure I've ever heard more of an understatement. This is not perfect. No, you killed two people. You essentially are attempting to occupy an American city with a hostile police force, masked thugs, pulling people out of their cars, breaking their windows to do so, dragging an elderly U.S. citizen out of his house in his shorts and robe in freezing Minneapolis temperatures. I've never seen anything quite like this. I've seen some bad stuff in the U.S., different stuff. Don't want to compare, atrocities, but this is an atrocity. This is terrible.
Well, and to follow up on that point, I think, Cliff, I'll hand it over to you. I've heard some people compare Minneapolis to Birmingham. Obviously, very different civil rights and what's going on with mass deportations and the raids, but that the significance of Minneapolis to the fight against fascism and the fight against bigotry is to is some comparison to Birmingham. Does that make sense?
Well, there's certainly a resonance there. You know, my my first rule of column writing was always, you know, never compare anything to the Holocaust, never compare anything to slavery. You know, and it because it's hard. As I said, every sort of atrocity and is different, but there's a resonance there, and one of the important things, I think, is the way that the people of Minneapolis have reacted and the way they have fought back. And it does bring to mind the kind of civil disobedience and passive resistance, some of the tactics that were employed in the civil rights movement. Certainly there's, you know, I think lessons were learned, and it's certainly time to apply them. One thing that's really different is that this is all being done over the objection of local officials elected by the people of Minneapolis and the people of Minnesota, who are, we don't want this, get out of here, stop this. And whereas, you know, civil rights movement local officials were obviously, you know, leading the oppression. And that's, again, it's shocking that, but it's the way this administration operates, and it's un-American, and it's so destructive. But people have fought back, and that fight, it looks, is going to bring some result.
Well, it's made a difference, right, in terms of the way people have reacted. I was going to bring this all up, and I want to talk a second in the context of your great, I can call it a great new book. I think it officially comes out at the beginning of February.
Yeah.
But you know, the name of the book, for everybody who doesn't know, is Freedom Lost, Freedom Won: A Personal History of America. And Eugene goes into his family history back to his great grandfather, who was a slave.
Yeah, my great grandfather was
great. I apologize. And I think this, you know, I think this all ties. That's what I'm saying. It doesn't mean that this is exactly the same thing, but I think of this. You know, I think of, you know, the first man to die fighting the British, Crispus Attucks, who is black, and then think of, we go forward, obviously, with slavery anyhow, because certain states wouldn't do it, and we have this horrific regime of slavery, and, you know, catching runaway slaves. We go all the way through the various terrible court decisions, like that obscure one in 1857. Obviously it wasn't obscure at all, and of course they made it so that if a slave escaped to the north, they could be yanked right back to the south, and it goes on to look. I think at some of what I was saying at the beginning of the show, some of the anti-immigration laws and then segregation, and so much of this, our history has always been based on race. So, you know, I mean, David asked if you saw the echoes in some ways, but you know, to get to your book, are there ways in which what's been going on informed you in writing your book?
Totally. You know, we can talk about this a bit later. I always knew that I had an unusually sort of long and deep documented history in America for an African American. Most African Americans, because we were not counted before the 1870 census, sort of show up then, and it's very difficult to find out anything before that. But I do have this great grandfather who was enslaved in Charleston and was sold in 1829 and sold again in 1848, and managed to purchase his own freedom in 1851. And so he shows up earlier, and we had this long oral history. That was always kind of in the background. And I knew that I would probably do a book about all of that at some point. But really, it was the first Trump administration that sort of crystallized what the storyline was. And I mean, there's characters and there's stories and there's stuff that happens, but the sort of skeleton, the scaffolding, really is these repeated times, the cycle where African Americans won, after a long, hard fight, won a greater measure of freedom and opportunity, only to have it taken away again. And it happened, obviously, to my great-great-grandfather or to one of his ancestors when, they were first captured and enslaved. It happened. It happened after he freed himself. That was in 1851. But in the decade running up to the Civil War in Charleston, South Carolina, where the war began, the freedom of free Black people was severely curtailed. Some were just seized and sent back into slavery. Others were forced from the state. If one of them left the state, they could never return. They had a thing about free Black people. They didn't like that. They thought they thought that was a bad thing.
How dare you?
And of course, it happened. After Reconstruction and then Jim Crow, right? That's the sort of big example. But it happened to it happened again to my great uncle, who, after he went off to in World War I to fight on the Western Front, and was treated like a man, and got back, and not only was he treated like a second-class citizen, but in that year of 1919, there were white on Black race riots across the country, in an episode that I really didn't know much about before I researched it. It was called the Red Summer, and this happened in Chicago.
Is that when the Palmer raids happened too, or am I off by a little bit?
That might be. I'm less familiar.
Those were anti-immigrant, which of course everybody was either white or non-white to them back then.
Probably,
right? So,
probably. And it happened, when after my father and his brothers finished their World War II service, again, having being treated like human beings when it was convenient, and then being put back in their place. And there were horrific incidents that happened to returning African Americans. And then we had the civil rights movement. We had the triumphs of the 1960s. We had a brief period of actual affirmative action, before the Bakke decision and Ronald Reagan essentially ended that. And we had after that.
He took that trip to Philadelphia, Mississippi. He kind of made it clear.
Philadelphia, Mississippi. There was a message there, right?
Yeah.
And the latest cycle was the election of Barack Obama, followed immediately by the election of Donald Trump, right? So I realized that was the framework that was going to support the book, and the other thing I realized was that, you talk about the history of immigrants, and I talk about that too, and their struggles, different groups, their struggles to win freedom and opportunity in this country. And one thing I realized is that every one of these histories, while distinct, they're all sort of strands of American history without which there is no American history. This is American history. So, the whole time I was writing the book, I felt I really was writing an American history, not an African American history, because the halting and often reversed attempts to make the words of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution apply to more people, that that implicates all of us and implicates the whole country. Who are
does.
we? It asks, every one of these cycles, we were essentially asking, who are we as a nation, and who do we want to be? And
Eugene, you mentioned that your family had a sort of an oral history that a lot of African American families did not. How much, though, did you learn more about your family in putting the book together, and what jumped out? What jumped out to you, or what was the biggest surprise or the biggest shock?
So I learned so much. I mean, the biggest shot. So when I grew up, there were 6 of us in my household. I grew up in the house that my great grandfather built in Orangeburg, South Carolina, and he was a pack rat. He kept everything. So his speeches and letters. He was a Reconstruction era success story.
Well, the pack rat for that time is amazing, because you wouldn't. Now you have those records, so that's
I have all those records. So I knew I had this treasure, and I had to write it. So, but there were 6 of us in the house, right? There was me and my sister and our parents, and we lived with my grandmother and my great aunt, who had lived in the house since it was built, basically in 1903, and so my great aunt never married, so she had no children, as far as I do. But I learned that a relative who would come to visit every once in a while, cousin Rosalie, I would always ask my mother, like, who's cousin Rosalie? How is she related? My mother would say, well, we don't know. And I knew, at 8 years old, I knew that wasn't true. But I didn't know what was true. And it turns out that cousin Rosalie was my great aunt's daughter. And,
wow.
And it was just something that hadn't been talked about in the family. I learned that a whole story about a great uncle who died before I was born, who did go to serve in the Army in a medical unit in World War I. And so I had to sort of research the whole, like, what was that about? How many African Americans went? Not all that many. What was their experience like? I learned an awful lot about that. He was my Uncle Marion, great Uncle Marion he had been trained to be a pharmacist, so he was assigned to a medical unit, and it was a mule-drawn ambulance, and the mule-drawn ambulances could go right up to the front because they could get through the mud and everything, and so he could go right up to the front where where the poison gas was and where the bombs were falling and this and that, and it explained to me why everybody in the family always said he was never quite the same after the war, and obviously, retrospectively, he must have had some form of PTSD, but that sort of thing. I learned a lot about my father's family because he was a taciturn. He was of the World War II generation, and they didn't share a whole lot about their feelings. And his story is fascinating because he took the route of the Great Migration in both directions. He, as a child, he and his family moved from Georgia, rural Georgia, to Ann Arbor, David, which is where my dad grew up, and he went to Michigan too, as did all my uncles and aunts.
And he grew up in Ann Arbor, and he was okay after that.
Yeah,
I say that just for David because he loves Michigan so much. It's just a joke.
I know. Listen, he and my uncles, the 2 uncles that I knew, are the only Black men I ever met of that generation who actually went to an integrated high school. Because Ann Arbor, guess what? Ann Arbor was in those days? It was a lefty college town, basically, and it was Ann Arbor. But I learned so much about his life and really his family just because, he didn't talk about that stuff. And I learned a lot about resilience and about if I ever had any doubt about how the struggle is, it's all process. It's not you don't get to the final result, the nirvana, everything is fine, and sweetness and light. You get to something that maybe starts to look like that, and then there's another fight, and so but I came out of it actually feeling more optimistic than when I went into it. And I certainly don't want to diminish the threat that I think this administration, this Trump administration, poses to the foundations of our democracy. I mean, I think it's horrific. But I did get a sense of how deep we had gone in the past, how deep into this abyss or that abyss we had gone in the past, and how with great effort and sometimes with bloodshed, we had emerged, and gradually over time emerged better. So
always the hope, obviously.
That's the hope.
Well, and I'm really big in this. I don't remember who. Maybe it was Obama. So it said something like, the arc of history always bends towards progress. It's just that sometimes you don't see it unless you take the really big picture.
Yeah. Dr. King said the arc of the
moral universe
is long, but it bends toward justice. Yeah.
Right. Well, and look, I mean, it's not to write this off. I mean, everything you said, Eugene, is so important. I mean, this is nothing close to normal. And obviously we have the very institutions. We've had this in the South. We've had this in other places. That's not to just say that. It's just, I don't think we've had this where the very institutions of our federal government are being either shut down, co-opted, corrupted to, in the way that, in a way that's dangerous towards us retaining any kind of a democracy. But knowing what, again, your book and everything there informs so much of it. And sometimes it's these little moments that seem to change history. And so I just think that's the important message to get to people. When you look at Minnesota, hell, we have a new Bruce Springsteen fight song now too. So we got that out there. He wrote a song about Minnesota, but I mean, like, we have to keep, because, I can't help it. Like, my background in history, I think of Rutherford Hayes walking away from walking away from Reconstruction to get electoral votes from Florida.
Votes, right.
I think of, like, here in Ohio, I live in Cincinnati, up in I don't know if you're a baseball fan, but up in Toledo, there's still a plaque where, where a guy that I may start a campaign, if you want to join me, to kick Cap Anson out of the Hall of Fame. He refused to play against a black player, Moses Fleetwood Walker, who was a terrific player on that field. And that is when the segregation of baseball started. It was not segregated then.
Wow.
And so, I think maybe from what you learned from your book, what do you think? What do you think you're now that folks should do? Make those little differences and make sure history goes in our direction. Do you have sort of anything any recommendations you would make that people be doing beyond what they're already doing?
I think one thing I learned is that when people leave their homes and go out and march and let their voices be heard and seen in numbers, that makes a difference. That's something that makes a difference. It certainly made a difference at various points in the civil rights movement.
Right.
And I think it's making a difference in Minneapolis, and I think those of us in other parts of the country ought to pay attention to that. I mean, I wonder why we haven't had, a new, not like the old March on Washington, but something like that. Why have we not had brought, 2, 3, 4 million people to Washington?
Yeah.
To to say no, this is not acceptable. This is not who we are. It's not who we want to be. It's not what we want this country to be. And we're taking that stand. And so I would hope that that's something that people think about. The other thing is that, you mentioned, sometimes an incident, something that happens, really galvanizes attention and changes people's minds. Obviously,
Sadly, we may have just had that thing.
Well, we may have just had that. Right. Selma was one of those moments. There was a moment right after the end of the Second World War that I kind of knew about, but I learned a whole lot more about. There was a black soldier named Isaac Woodard who was in Georgia, stationed in Georgia, got discharged, was taking a bus ride from his base in Georgia to his home in North Carolina, and they cut through a corner of South Carolina. And in South Carolina, he had a dispute with the bus driver over whether they would stop at a rest stop, right? And so the bus driver didn't want to stop, and he wanted to stop. So the driver stopped, and then at the next town in South Carolina, the bus driver stopped the bus, called the sheriff. The sheriff arrested the soldier, Isaac Woodard, and he was, and they took him into an alley and they beat him to a pulp, and they took him back to the police station and beat him more and gouged his eyes to the point where he was blinded, permanently blinded. His family, found him in a local hospital. Oh, they found him guilty of disorderly conduct, by the way, and fined him $50. His family was frantically searching for him, found him a couple of weeks later. And that really, you could argue that was a spark that helped galvanize the whole civil rights movement.
Right.
And people like Orson Welles, who had a radio show, heard about it from the NAACP, and he started broadcasting nationwide about it. And Pete Seeger wrote a song about it called "The Blinding of Isaac Woodard," and it made President Harry Truman, kind of vaguely knew about it. It made him aware that this was that this had been an atrocity, and he, since nobody was going to prosecute the people who committed this awful act, he ordered a federal prosecution of the sheriff and the deputies who
Right.
this man. And some people would argue that this helped move Truman to desegregate the armed forces, for example.
Right.
So one spark can really ignite a fire, and maybe Minneapolis is that spark.
And Eugene, you mentioned resilience that is required, that you saw both in your own sort of family history, but the resilience of our nation as we go through these various cycles, perseverance, resilience, however you want to describe it. Do you therefore, when you see the response in places like Minneapolis, or when you see the way people are responding, peacefully and with the whistles and everything else, does that therefore, do you see that perhaps a little bit differently than a lot of other folks because you're so familiar, resilience is so steeped in your, essentially in your family history and your background and your knowledge of who you are at the core?
I think maybe. I mean, I just, first of all, like you, I'm a journalist, and that requires learning some history, and so it's, but also, I lived through a good deal of the civil rights movement in my hometown in South Carolina, in Orangeburg, South Carolina, and there was in my hometown an incident called the Orangeburg Massacre in 1968 when I was in high school, in which 3 Black students were gunned down by by state troopers. The students were, of course, unarmed. They were participating in a demonstration over a segregated bowling alley. And sure enough, the state troopers opened fire on the crowd. They shot 30 people, and 3 of them died. So that I think I maybe have a somewhat better sense than many people may of A, how bad it can get, and B, the magnitude of the obstacles that can be overcome. Not easy, but so maybe I have somewhat less of a tendency to believe all is lost.
Well, and I sort of wonder if there's a natural, and by the way, we're having a little technical issue, so we're
There we go.
there we go. The screen was a little off.
Better. I don't know what happened. I apologize for.
All right. So
this time it wasn't even
wonder,
me.
Eugene, if one of the other things sort of we're up against in this day and age is sort of the modern American media, and that it rewards chaos and violence and clashes. And so there's a lot of attention, of course, on that, but it doesn't, the media's just because of, it doesn't really attract so much of an audience to say, hey, look at all these tens of thousands of people who are demonstrating in the minus 10 degrees in Minneapolis, or look at all these people who get together for the No Kings rally. It's far more gripping to scare the hell out of people by showing, riots or fires or people being gunned down, scare your audience, and then your audience is going to watch you longer. And so I almost wonder if the dynamics of the modern media make it even that much more difficult for us to focus on the resilience and the perseverance of people.
They make it much, much harder, David, much harder. And it's not just, the sort of, if it bleeds, it leads kind of philosophy or reality. But it's also just the atomization of media and the way people get their news and information. Right. Not just that there's a far right information silo and a not far right information silo, but that so many people get their news and information from social media, and
right.
So even if there were people say, where's our Walter Cronkite, who could go to Vietnam and then and see what was happening and then come back and tell America this is not working. This is you're being lied to, basically. Well, if we did have a Walter Cronkite, his audience would be what, a tenth of what that audience, if that, and so this is a whole nother book, I mean.
Yeah. Well, can I say this, Eugene?
This is a I see it as a threat to democracy as we have known it. If there is no shared sort of chronology of events and encyclopedia of facts, then how do we, if we don't have a baseline, how can we constructively argue about what to do when we don't even agree on what just happened? It's a problem.
Well, I ask this question often. I mean, I think I kind of, in a way, what you're saying, there's the two opposite sides, and they've hurt us from each side. So you have the atomization on one side, and there's a reason why these very right wing, very wealthy guys are usually get angry at like Europe, at Western Europe and other places that try to find ways to stop disinformation from coming in, because they know they all benefit from disinformation. They want that out there on social media. And I would argue that, to me, we've gotten to an extreme. The First Amendment, is the First Amendment. If you're lying to people about things like vaccines and other things that cause people to die, Yeah. Are you inciting riot? I mean, there's, Europe has tried to limit this, and that's why Musk keeps fighting it, of course.
Yeah.
So on one end, we have all this disinformation, this garbage pumped into our media bloodstream through social media, and they won't even regulate. There's no First Amendment issue with stopping Russian bots. They wouldn't even bother to do that.
No.
Right. But then on the other side, where when you guys and I all probably, were earlier on in our careers where it was even, we all went on cable television, things like that, where it was bad enough that there were 12 entities or 18 entities or 35. There's now 6 that basically control everything. And, so anything you'd see in a movie like The Insider is, there's everybody's has to go to corporate, go to their lawyers. I mean, is that going to be okay? Are we going to offend the consulting division of our company if we tell a story about this? And I see that as just as big a danger. You wouldn't have a Walter Cronkite. I mean, a quick story I'll tell. I was paid, they called me specifically the liberal analyst at Sinclair, as you can imagine. And they sent, and they sent the head of their Washington bureau, who they thought was, a moderate conservative, to Iraq during the war. This is about 20 years. I mean, 2004. Yeah. And he came back and he wanted to tell stories from all sides, and tell fair stories. And they would not let him. And it became a public fight. And he was gone. So you got this corporate. I don't know that the Bush administration ever ordered them to do it, but they as people that wanted to expand their empire, buy more channels, and are right wing in their orientation in general, we're like, nope, we're not going to show that. So we have it coming from that side too.
Yeah.
And that's I mean, that to me is such if Walter Cronkite came back and wanted to talk about Iraq, they'd kick him off the airwaves at Sinclair.
Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. They would. I mean, they totally would. And, you're right. It's that concentration of ownership. Look, you're talking to a 45-year veteran of the Washington Post, right?
That's why I brought that up. I know you're a pro.
Right. I was going to ask you about that.
So, yeah, we can talk about that. I mean, this is...
start ripping into the Washington Post, man. We would love it. We'll get there. I'm just kidding. Do it, whatever you want to say.
No, I mean, it is... what has happened and what is happening in the Washington Post is just a tragedy for it feels tragic for me personally, for everybody I know who has worked for the Post, and I think for all who cherish a free press, a vigorous press, and that newspaper as it was. It has been a very, very special place. And as somebody who, was hired in the days of Katharine Graham and Ben Bradley, great editorial page editor, Meg Greenfield, these were giants, and there ain't no giants.
Oh yeah. You think like the Pentagon Papers, or you think, Watergate. What if the guys there had just said, nah, we're not going to do that. Nixon said he didn't do it. That's Barry Weiss's
stuff. Yeah, right. We can't run the story till we get a quote from Nixon, right?
Right. We need to know what Nixon thinks on Nixon's crimes before we report.
Eugene, you got out a couple of years ago. You were among sort of the first wave when Bezos was over. But so I mean, hats off to you for sort of seeing this train that was sort of coming. But what do you make of it now? There's still an effort to try to somehow, save some jobs in the Washington Post, and Jeff Bezos looks like there's going to be massive layoffs. What do you make of what's happening now?
Okay, so what's happening now is I left roughly a year ago when Bezos. Jeff Bezos issued his edict about this change that was going to happen to the opinion pages, that it was going to, be all about free markets and personal liberties, and basically doesn't give a crap about anything else, and the then editorial page editor, David Shipley, whom I like and admire, left. And I knew at that minute, okay, well, I'm out of here, right? I mean, this is not, you didn't have to be a seer to see.
You didn't want to write all Cato Institute stories.
No, I'm not a Cato Institute kind of guy. Look, I like free markets. I like personal liberties. I also like social justice, and I like
There you go.
and I like I like a lot of
You
things.
can like all of that stuff together. The problem
That's
is
right.
Bezos only likes a few of them.
So that's the opinion side, and I realize a lot of readers and viewers don't make as hard and fast a separation between opinion and news as we do in journalism, but there is such a division. The opinion side, as far as I'm concerned, has just gone to perdition. It's gone to hell. It's the pieces that a lot of what they're running, isn't even technically in terms of how arguments are being made and supported. It's just not. It's not even good. It's kind of mediocre. Shoddy arguments.
Yeah.
It's so the news side, however, has continued to vigorously report on this administration. Has broken a lot of stories. That's why I've continued to, I've kept my subscription to the Washington Post. I want because the news side has been doing what it should. Now, if I were executive editor, I might be doing things a bit differently, but I might be a bit more aggressive. But I'm not going to, that's different. What's happening on the news side, or what has happened on the news side, is different. What they're talking about now is a wave of impending layoffs that would be ordered, would be draconian, and that would deeply
be on the news side.
On the news side, yes,
Yeah.
that would cut into sports and Metro in particular, but necessarily have impact and throughout the news side, and
Sure.
and they're talking about the idea being to essentially shrink the Post, to focus just on national politics and government, and so maybe that would allow a good deal of the accountability and investigative journalism that's going on now to continue. I think it probably would, but to me that shrinks the Post into Politico or Axios or whatever. I mean, there are a lot of people out there who are like, we're gonna be the go-to site for Washington. We're going to give you Washington, and the proposition at the Post was always, we're going to give you Washington. We're going to give you a whole lot more. The other place that is rumored to be about to really face the axe is the foreign staff, and again, I spent 11 years on the foreign staff, 6 of them overseas and 5 as an editor here in Washington. And that's obscene. It is just.
Well, luckily, we haven't been doing anything abroad lately. So
Yeah, no, nothing's been going on abroad, and it's just such a betrayal of this rich heritage and legacy and history that has been written at the Washington Post over the last, nearly 100 years, and it's unnecessary. I mean, it's so I blame Jeff Bezos. I blame the Will Lewis, who was the publisher, who, I don't know, maybe trying to save his job and make his numbers look better with layoffs, and who has said, again, this is all, not all of this has happened yet, but is said to have been to be pushing this idea of a smaller national politics and government only sort of Washington Post, which is just so stupid. And
it's like you're giving up territory that you've done well in
thank
voluntarily.
you. Yes. Now, that's all we've been doing. That's all the Post has been doing for the last like 3 years. We, look at the Post lost 250,000 subscribers after Jeff Bezos refused to let the opinion section run the endorsement of Kamala Harris that had already been written and edited. And it lost a bunch more when the personal liberties and free markets edict came out. The Post has really gone out of its way to insult, demean, and drive away its readers. Boy, what a business plan, huh?
It's amazing. They really have, because for a while there, I thought after the Hillary election, it was it was more the New York Times that so many people were angry at because of the email stories everywhere, and the Washington Post wasn't taking as much of the brunt of that. But they seem like they've really tried to catch up. They've really worked hard to anger people just as much.
Yeah, more actually. I mean, we've beaten the Times on that. That's for sure.
Oh man. Well, let me ask you this, because again, and I respect what you're saying about the news division. I mean, look, even the Wall Street Journal news division has produced some good stories, and we know the owner over there. So, but my big problem is that because of all of the disinformation out there, because of so much of that, and we know so many people just will read the headline or the first few paragraphs, and the way they frame these things so that is maybe a few of them finally on the case with Alex Preddy called Trump a liar, maybe finally, but it takes so much for them to just say the truth. So that they have to pretend that there's two sides to everything that I don't think you get anything from the headline. And most people don't have the time to read the rest, who have two jobs and are busy in their lives and kids. And that's what frustrates me, honestly.
Well, it frustrates me too. Okay. I mean, and has frustrated me. And if I were still at the Post, again, we have this division, right? Opinion and news. But I would occasionally, when I was there, I would fire off, late night rockets to the executive editor saying, that headline is total bullshit, and it needs to, there are not two sides to this story, and don't pretend that. And then I'd feel better, but it wouldn't necessarily change the headline.
Eugene, if you were advising a younger person, and I'm thinking in mind of my my nephew who loves, still has this romantic view of journalism and Washington Post reporters and globetrotting news correspondents. Would you recommend younger people these days still be open to the idea of journalism as a profession, or somebody young that what would you say to them?
Well, I believe in journalism. I believe journalism is necessary. And I believe that on some fundamental level, we want to know what's going on, right? We want to know what's going on around us. And it starts from something as basic as that. And then you want it done in a way that's, accurate and professional, and that you can count on. So I think there will always be a need for journalism. So I would encourage young people to hear the calling of journalism, right? Journalism as a calling, as which in some ways maybe it is, and almost that broadly. Because I cannot tell you, when I was coming out of Michigan, it was very clear. There were very, very clear career paths, right? And they just aren't now. newspapers were expanding and growing, and there were the news magazines, and there was this, and there was that, there was broadcasting. People would, decide which way they wanted to go, and then they would go that way. And now I wouldn't know which way to turn coming out, coming out into the world, into journalism, and that's a real burden to put on people to say, well, you're going to have to be flexible, you're going to have to be aware, you're going to have to, and you might have to go up some blind alleys before you find a viable path in journalism. But if you feel, that that's what you're called to do, and if you feel that that's an important thing to do, then I would encourage them to sort of keep at it, and as new sort of paths and openings will be created, and there will be opportunities, I think, to do good and noble work in journalism. I certainly hope so. And I say that as our government is now being run by people who don't want that to happen, right? Who don't want.
We're waiting for the lawsuit to come to Blue Amp Media. I mean, I think it's just a matter of time before we get the demand letter, whatever it is, of the threats from the Trump administration for whatever.
Exactly.
Or, a drone outside my window here I can wave to, kind of thing. Like, that.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, this is but it's yet here we are, right? Yeah. Here we are. So so we're gonna keep trying. We're gonna keep doing.
Yeah, we have to. I mean, I do think my hope is we've had some younger folks on who are using newer platforms. Obviously, we're on some newer platforms here. That there will be still ways to, I mean, I'm not saying that you can't work for any of the mainstream media either. It's just obviously there aren't as many jobs as there once were.
No, there aren't. There are not as many jobs, and one problem that I have, and I just don't know what the solution to this is, but size sometimes matters. I mean, when I look at the resources,
ask Greg Bavino. He knows.
Well, yeah, right.
Sorry. Go ahead.
Right, I know that. And I mean, what is he, like 5'2" or something like that? And with that
on a spiked hair day, he gets up there.
Spiked hair day. I mean, it's just a bit. But no, it. When I think of the resources that the New York Times or the old NBC News or the Washington Post could bring to an event or to any sort of news story, and all the different angles you could look at, and what you could do. You could really, you could do you could do things that you can't do as a sort of sole practitioner.
Oh God, Gene, when I started at MSNBC in Hardball in 2002, I had a full-time producer, I had a camera crew, I had a full-time, I mean, it was, just for me, for this 3.5 minute piece to set up for Chris Matthews on cable, a particular story or issue. I mean, we had 5 people. And, and that's just MSNBC. NBC News had all kinds of
NBC News was just insane, I mean, it was you'd go up to 30 Rock and it's just like full of people and they're all doing, all the stuff.
And there were bureaus. I mean, I think of, wherever. I mean, I grew up in New York City, and then I lived in the Washington area, and I moved out here to Cincinnati, where my wife's from. And, all of these places, there would be like, in a not that big town outside of the big city, there would be a local division of that paper. There would be, there used to be the place where one of our favorite people, J.D. Vance, is from, Middletown. That's not very far from here. And by the way, it's not in Appalachia. That was another lie of his. Folks.
Exactly.
It's nowhere near Appalachia, but that's 30 minutes from here. And there was, I had a neighbor in the past who was this great reporter for the Cincinnati Enquirer, lifetimer, terrific guy. And he had been the head of the Middletown Bureau at one point because they had the money. Now they barely have the money to put out a Cincinnati Enquirer. I mean, it's just, it's we've lost so much. There's so many news deserts.
Yeah, no. Look, as recently as when I was in South America for the Post, just in Buenos Aires, there were scads of American correspondents. There was a correspondent, of course, for the New York Times, the Washington Post, but the Chicago Tribune had a correspondent in Buenos Aires, and CBS News had a correspondent who lived in Buenos Aires and did feeds for radio and television. The Los Angeles Times, the Newsday, the Boston Globe had a South America reporter. There are major metropolitan areas in the country now that, I think Atlanta is one. They're not going to have an actual physical newspaper, ink on paper newspaper.
Really?
Yeah.
Are they getting to that point? I mean, I know that New Orleans is like once a week now, and
exactly, and some have reduced frequency, and I believe it was the Atlanta Journal-Constitution that's going web only, and that for some reason inevitably means also that, by the way, we're going to do more with less in terms of reporting resources, and you know what? If you want to do more, you need more.
Yeah. Well, I want to do more before I have to leave to pick up the kids. Final question to you, Eugene, and that is regarding Trump and the Trump era. How does this end? And are you optimistic or pessimistic about
what day is it? What day is it? Some days I am optimistic, and some days I am almost in despair. And what I despair about is, even when I convince myself that institutions will hold enough so that Trump actually leaves at the end of his term, right? So we do have an election and we elect somebody else, but what will have been destroyed, and how
how do we rebuild that is the question, right? How do we rebuild that or build new institutions to make up for it?
Exactly, because I think a lot of what we had is going to be rubble. It's just going to be. And
oh my God, I covered the Department of Justice for a long time, and based on friends who still have contacts there, it's going to take 10 years to rebuild the Department of Justice, the public integrity section, to be able to go after public corruption and all the things they were doing.
Civil rights division. There used to be a civil rights division in the Department of Justice that has played a historic role in this country.
And there's organizations like USAID. And it's sort of like, how do we get anybody out there to trust us again? How do we get the resources to people again? I mean,
well, no, and I don't look. I certainly don't think the rest of the world is going to trust this country the way it once did. Period. I mean, we elected this guy not once but twice. Okay, so the first time that could be a fluke. If I were in any other country, I'd be saying, look, the second time it's on you. It's a you problem. Okay,
they should all be uniting and building, which they are to a certain degree. But I don't think during my lifetime, if they're smart, they would trust us again. I hate to say that, but I mean,
no, and I think they won't. And I think they're going to, do what they're kind of doing right now. Like in Europe, they've got the one guy, Rutter, the head of NATO, who makes nice with Trump and says Trump is really, is a good guy. And meanwhile, everybody else is there. I mean, they're actively planning and trying to prepare themselves for for a time when the U.S. is entirely unreliable. They just can't rely on us.
So I guess the final question then for you is, then you don't believe that Greenland truly belonged to us the way Trump said. Am I correct?
No, I don't think so. I've looked at that, and
it wasn't just a bunch of boats that landed somewhere, and there was no documentation.
A boat landed 500 years ago, and so no, I think Greenland. Funny enough, I think it actually belongs to the people who've lived there all long.
And I give those people a tremendous amount of credit for this surprise attack, this preemptive attack on the U.S. Northeast that they've launched over the last week. I think the high today is 7 degrees, and we're not getting above 20 until next week. I surrender, Greenland. Take your weather back.
You know, I give respect to Greenland.
You know, take it back. You can do whatever. You know, we'll leave you alone. Just leave us alone.
You know, please help us to stop doing this. Stop freezing
tired.
us here.
Eugene, I got to run, but I got to say, such a pleasure. Obviously, every time I see you on TV or MSNBC or MS Now, whatever you're doing, and your books, and it's just such a pleasure to be reconnected with you. And thanks so much for doing this. We really appreciate it.
Well, this is terrific. I really had fun. Obviously,
thank you. I just want to make sure people know again, it's Freedom Lost, Freedom Won: Personal History of America, and you can pre-order it now, folks. So
look
at that. It looks fascinating. I'm excited to read it. I want to thank you too, Eugene. You know, I reached out to you after I saw that you were on Hardball on the day I was there, and you were kind enough to answer graciously and right away and tell us you'd join us. And this has been as great a show, and you know, as I thought it would be. So thank you for being here.
Well, thanks a lot. Thanks for having me, and I'll come back sometime.
We'll have you on for sure.
Talk to you guys later.
All right. Good show, Cliff Schechter. Well done.
Thank you.
Yes, well done. Bye-bye.
Thank you both for being here. Thanks to our audience as always. Thanks for being here. We don't have one. Well, we are on Thursday, so none tomorrow. We'll be back next week. We'll still have Substacks flying out to you and videos at YouTube. And you can subscribe at blueamp.co is probably a good way to our Substack if you like these kinds of things. And, you know, David, as the sun sets slowly in the west, I bid you all a fond farewell.